how much funds do countries need to raise for climate adjustment and climate mitigation? Do they need to raise a lot, or is it cheap?
So estimates of the investment required for transition to low carbon economy are within the range between 1.6 trillion US dollars to 3.8 trillion US dollars for the period until 2050 annually. And these estimates are only for supply side energy investment systems alone. On the adaptation side, costs are estimated to be around 180 billion US dollars annually for the period from 2020 to 2030. So if we compare now these estimates with actual climate finance flows, then we can see whether we have sufficient, let's say, funds in order to facilitate transition to low carbon economy. So climate finance flows have increased significantly over the last 5 years. And they reached highest levels in 2017 and 2018, first time crossing a mark of $500 billion US dollars. So the highest capital flows reached the level of about $6 billion US dollars in 2017. So now if we compare this number, 600 billion US dollars, which actually is needed for supply side energy investments, then we can see they represent only between 15 to 35% of what is required in order to meet the requirements of the Paris Agreement. So clearly, despite all efforts, climate actions still unfortunately fall short of what is needed.
So how do you see the role of environmental taxes, especially carbon taxes? Can they be raised without increasing inequalities that already exist? Because we know that environmental taxes are regressive taxes mostly, so they can increase social inequalities. How do you see the role, the future role?
Well, I think that carbon taxes are indispensable for reducing emissions in a more efficient way, as well as for meeting the requirements of the Paris Agreement. On the other hand, I agree with you that much resistance against carbon taxation was motivated by concerns that they will be inequitable. In the sense, they will generate regressive distributional impacts for consumers and for the purchasing power. However, so unfortunately, climate policies could have such undesirable impacts. However, such impacts are not inevitable in the sense carbon tax policies should be complemented with policies which manage distributional impacts as well. And in this way, when carbon tax policies are complemented with facilitating policies, then I think climate policies can be acceptable both socially and politically.
And of course, we have big debates here in the industrialized, rich EU countries, but it's also an issue for developing countries. So do you think that green taxes can help developing countries to leapfrog, so to say, a dirty development path? And this is one part. And then I think it's even more complicated for resource-rich countries. You also come from a resource-rich country, Kazakhstan. So should also resource-dependent countries implement environmental taxes or other forms of environmental pricing?
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like, as I already mentioned, carbon taxes are an important part of climate policies for every country, including developing ones. And I also believe that carbon taxation might help leapfrog some of the existing fossil fuel technologies for developing countries. Even though I also share opinion that leapfrogging in general as a strategy could be sometimes over-optimistic way to look at the issues that developing countries face, because we also need to be aware of the fact that it's not always the case that developing countries have capacities to utilize technologies which originated in developed world. So, but in this way, I guess carbon taxes could be helpful as well, because it will help to generate capacity for innovation within developing countries as well. With respect to developing resource-rich economies, again, I believe that they need to introduce some form of carbon taxes as well. And here there are several issues. I think they face much more complex situation with respect to carbon taxes because of two reasons. The first one, if you apply standard principle, let's say, of Pigovian taxation or polluter pays principle, then taxation should happen at the point of consumption. But we know that many resource-rich economies export the fossil fuels. But in this way, I guess they are losing some of the rents that they can generate from taxation the fossil fuels. So I guess one of the potential ways to deal with this situation will be to impose higher taxation within the developing countries so that they can generate more revenues or like introducing maybe border taxation as well. And the second element that we need to understand is, of course, if developing resource-rich countries consume dirty products within the countries, then clearly, in order to deal with this type of environmental damage, they have to introduce taxes in order to address the externality and also generate some other benefits relating to reducing other externalities related to congestion or improving the health in the country and so on. So again, I feel developing countries will benefit from some form of eco or green taxes.
Mm-hmm.